Well, we're ready to go. So welcome to the webinar hosted by Catholic Investment Services. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion about the recently revised socially responsible investment guidelines issued by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. My name is Tom Lanctot. I'm privileged to serve as Chief Executive Officer of Catholic Investment Services. My colleague Zela Astarjian has done a great job organizing this program and is at the Zoom controls and will moderate the discussion. Catholic Investment Services was founded by some of the investment industry's most respected leaders to address the investment challenges faced by Catholic organizations. We are a Catholic nonprofit providing investment solutions for other Catholic nonprofits and their investment consultants, and now manage over $1 billion of client assets in 4 different strategies. Enormous thanks to our world-class panelists, whom you'll meet shortly. Today's format will be conversational. There will be time for audience questions during and after the formal part of the program, so please use the Q&A feature on your Zoom screen to submit a question. Our audience is muted. The program is being recorded and will be available for replay on our CIS Institute webpage and in podcast format. You received biographical information for our panelists, but I want to highlight a few points. In addition to being a friend and supporter of CIS, Bernard Brenninkmeijer is a noted global practitioner and thought leader in impact and socially responsible investing. Bernard recently organized and now leads Constanter Philanthropy Services, which serves as the operational support organization for the Brenninkmeijer's extensive philanthropic activities. Bernard also chairs the board of the Porticus North America Foundation and is a director of FADICA, where he has been a catalyst for its mission-driven investing education efforts. As many of you know, CIS founder and board chair Schott Malpass is the retired chief investment officer of the University of Notre Dame, where for 32 years he was responsible for investing the university's endowment and other assets. Notre Dame's endowment is one of the largest private university endowments in American higher education and the largest at a Catholic university. Institutional Investor magazine has called Schott an investment titan, an MVP, and he certainly is all of that and more for CIS. Steve Schott is another legend, particularly among Catholic institutional investors. His team at CapTrust is routinely recognized as among the most accomplished and respected consultants serving institutional clients. Like our other panelists, Steve is a man for all seasons, having served as chief operating officer of the Cincinnati Reds, a trustee of the Pro Football Hall of Fame, a member of the BCS Orange Bowl Committee, and board investment committee member for numerous athletic, civic, and religious organizations. Steve also brings academic balance to our panel, having graduated from Denison University, the alma mater of 2 of my children. Before we begin our program, please join me in a short prayer. Dear God, please grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. We pray for peace and special blessings for all those whose lives have been so violently disrupted by the actions of the Russian government, and the humanitarian nightmare is unleashed. Amen.
Amen.
Our goal today is to help Catholic institutions understand and apply, as they think best, the USCCB's updated SRI guidelines. Alignment with the guidelines is voluntary. As Bernard likes to say, and will expound on in today's program, we are all on a faith-based investing journey, and the important thing is to be engaged with the subject. By sharing the experience and wisdom of our panel, we hope to contribute to a constructive discussion and better understanding of the updated USCCB guidelines by Catholic institutions and their consultants. Catholic Investment Services has developed a robust, distinctive, and thoughtful Catholic socially responsible investing process. Our original focus, like that of many other Catholic investors, was on screening to avoid doing harm. More recently, we've developed a private markets impact investing strategy in partnership with Hamilton Lane that seeks to make positive and intentional investments in companies that align well with Catholic SRI principles and that we think are great businesses offering attractive returns. Zela, I'm now going to turn the program over to you. You're going to provide a few introductory remarks about the guidelines and also moderate our discussion. So take it away.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Very pleased to be here.
I want to start with a few historical background information on the USCCB guidelines, and then we'll just get into the questions in a minute or two. So the USCCB first provided socially responsible investment guidelines in 1991, and they were then revised in 2003. This past December, as most of you know, they released the revised guidelines. So this is the third time in 30 years that the USCCB has revised its guidelines. Catholic Investment Services has put together a summary document and the goal of that document was to help Catholic fiduciaries with the facts about the guidelines and the changes. And we shared it with a bunch of you here on the call. But if you haven't received it, feel free to send us an email. We're happy to send it to you. Just email us at info@catholicinvest.org. Again, info@catholicinvest.org. Gathering data and implementing the socially responsible investment guidelines issued by the USCCB has and continues to be expensive for specialist active managers, and particularly it's difficult for alternative investments. Customization of restricted lists for multiple Catholic institutions historically has been limited to large liquid indexes like the S&P 500 or the MSCI ACWI. The newest guidelines seem to have aligned themselves more closely with ESG investing and provide a menu of corporate engagement options. This is primarily conducted by voting proxies, but also dialogue with management. If Catholic institutions are interested in pursuing engagement opportunities that include this dialogue with management, there are several organizations that can be helpful with shareholder advocacy. And I'm going to provide a couple of names. For instance, first one that comes to mind is ICCR, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. There's also SEEK, the Catholic Impact Investing Collaborative, and Mercy Investment Services, among others. I will share this info on the chat in a few seconds. With that, let's turn to questions for the panelists. I think the first question that comes to mind is, how do you allocate assets as a Catholic fiduciary? Scott, maybe we can start with you. You have invested with Catholic social teaching guidelines for over 30 years with tremendous results. If you could, please, can you give us your perspective on this topic?
Sure, and good morning, everyone. It's nice to have a chance to be with all of you, and thanks for all your support. And thanks to Steve and Bernard for participating today, two really devout and thoughtful Catholics who've really enhanced the discussion of these topics over the years. So let me just say, in terms of allocating assets as a Catholic fiduciary, obviously, we use traditional asset allocation models of risk and return to think about asset classes. And we always wanted to take advantage of some of the illiquidity premiums you can achieve in private investing. But regardless of the asset class, there was always a lens of the principles of Catholic social teaching. At Notre Dame, we had a policy on social responsibility investing going back to the 40s. And obviously that document evolved. It's actually an interesting history to read through that over the years. As markets became more complicated, more global, more information available, there was quite an evolution in the document. But the constant was always some of these core principles that are timeless. We call Catholic social teaching. And so the document was more a response to sort of modern practices than anything else, and trying to keep up with all that. But we always had that lens. And honestly, it included things like the values of the people we were investing with. We did a lot of checks on people. Want to make sure we're working with the right kind of people who are very skilled and very good at what they do, because obviously we have a fiduciary duty and a stewardship responsibility to our donors and our campus, but we want to work with the right kind of people. So even things like that, we just really scrutinized carefully. The valor vendors, same thing. All the people who worked with the endowment in terms of our custodian, the various vendors you use, the managers. And then in terms of implementation, like most Catholic investors, it was primarily an exclusionary approach. We would buy information from ISS, the various screens, and then develop appropriate lists for our managers. and talked through that with them. I did an annual letter to all our managers with the list, but the list was obviously important, but the most important thing was my description of why this is important to us, and why we need their partnership and understanding to help us do this. And we were very fortunate. We had people who really did try to make sure we were consistent with these guidelines. But so it was more exclusionary, but in a very positive spirit of cooperation and partnership with managers. As things evolved, we did our own proxy voting, took a very active role. Before it was all electronic, we would have stacks of proxies in the office that we would hand vote. It wasn't that long ago, but obviously it's a lot easier now. But we took control of that fully and made sure that we had positions on all the key issues that might affect Catholic investors. And then we did occasionally engage management. It wasn't, that's something the new guidelines are calling for more of. And quite frankly, back in the 80s with the apartheid issue, our former president, Father Ted Hesburgh, very legendary president of Notre Dame, used to write CEOs of companies doing business with the South African government. So that was an example of some real engagement with management. I think that did have an impact at the time. Now that's sort of a lost art today, but I think the new guidelines, both here and at bishops' conferences around the world, are calling for more of that proactive approach. So those are some of the things we did, and that continues to evolve. And I'll pause there.
Bernard, would you want to add your perspective?
Yeah, happy to add a little bit to what Scott has been saying from my perspective and what I've learned in trying to implement the Bishop's guidelines over the years. It really all comes down to the dialogue that you create with your asset managers. And it's what I've learned again and again is that you sometimes enter these discussions with a degree of fear. Will they accept it? Are they receptive to it, etc.? And I've almost universally found that people are interested in the discussion if you bring it in the right way. If it comes from a place of conviction, if it comes from a place of making the world a better place, if it comes from advancing the mission of the organization that you're representing, and then it does come across and leads to very interesting discussions about the values that they're already trying to incorporate and the overlap and how you're working with exclusion lists, but how you're looking to go beyond that. And so obviously it's a different discussion that you have with a hedge fund manager versus an equity manager versus a bond fund manager, but each is receptive if you bring it in the right way, I have found. And so we have worked across the asset allocation spectrum, impact managers, where again, you have very different conversations that are possible. And so as long as you go into it respecting the opportunities in the asset class, but always we've found with an idea of pushing people a little bit past where they are today, that bit by bit you see all sorts of movement and progress.
You're right. I like that pushing people a comment you have. Bernard, you have the benefit of living in Europe right now, and you've attended school in the US at Notre Dame. You're also very involved with FADICA. Wondering if you could comment on the European guidelines a little bit and how different they are from the US ones.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fascinating topic. If you see the different guidelines, I'll comment today a little bit on the German and the Austrian bishops' guidelines, which I've looked at most. And you see sort of really progression in them over time, as well as the mentioned evolution of the US bishops' guidelines. And what you see is that more and more clearly, all of the conferences are taking up Pope Francis's call to really align your mission and your investments. That investments are not a values-free zone, and the Austrian bishops are quite specific in that, where they just say that investment is not ethically neutral, and that there is a real obligation to use your assets responsibly. And I think that matches, one-to-one with Pope Francis's call to lead an integral life and to try and create an integral ecology and integral human development. And that's where I think the European bishops are a little bit further also, perhaps a little closer to Pope Francis physically. It rubs off a little more, but they're really also saying, you know, as a Catholic institution, you really should be doing this. It's beyond a guideline or a might or could consider. You should be doing this. And I think that you're probably over time going to see more and more developments in that direction, where bishops' conferences at different speeds and on different issues, because you see there are different focus points that each of them sets in terms of the big lines are all the same, but there are always different focus points. That over time there's going to be a progress and an expectation that we move towards more and more faith-consistent investing as Catholic investors and Catholic institutions.
Wonderful. Love your European perspective. Scott, given your involvement with the Vatican board, I was wondering if you could also comment on the Vatican faith-consistent investing guidelines.
Yeah, sure. So as most of the audience knows, I serve on the board of the Institute for the Works of the Religion, which has an Italian acronym IOR, which is commonly called the Vatican Bank. I know in the US there's some confusion exactly on that, but so we have a very detailed faith-consistent investment policy. It's evolved. Again, modern databases and the delivery of those databases make it easier. Now they're not cheap always, but does make it easier to access information. And so we have a team at the Vatican Bank who spends time managing that process. The good news and bad news is most of the investments are really in sovereign bonds, you know, of European countries. So the implementation is fairly easy because they're not doing alternatives. But as we try to transform the asset management function over time, these issues are going to be more complicated for them. So we're sort of working through how that might work. You know, and there's some new innovations in ETFs and Catholic ETFs, and there's hopefully going to be more product available to Catholic investors that'll make implementation, you know, easier over time, and they monitor all of those developments as well. The broader Holy See has put together a task force over the last few years to develop, you know, a set of guidelines for the Universal Church. And they had a committee meeting regularly for about 3 years, maybe a little more. And they've come up with a draft document, which has not been published yet, but it's very detailed with a lot of commentary on Catholic social teaching and some of the key principles that underlie the document and the reason for some of the recommendations or proposals that are in the guidelines. So a lot of background, which is very helpful to a Catholic investor. So I'm hoping they will eventually publish that. I think it's a very good document. And, you know, I would expect to see that over the next few months, maybe within the next year. But that would apply then to all of the dicasteries and anybody doing any kind of investing in the Holy See. It's very consistent with what the Vatican Bank has already come up with as well. So those would mesh very well. So they definitely feel they need to be at the forefront of that and have a document that reflects that for the Universal Church.
Yeah, that fixed income thing is such a European thing, right? Anyway, we see that a lot in Europe. Anyway, Steve,
yes,
next question is for you. What has changed with the newly revised USCCB guidelines? Can you give us like a high level summary? And like I said, we have a document we're happy to send to folks if they're interested.
Yes, and allow me to start off with, first of all, thank you for allowing me to be part of such an esteemed group as yourself, with Scott, with Tom, with Bernard. And as I've listened to the introductions here, you know, there has been, I'm going on 40 years of working with Catholic dioceses and archdioceses in our firm. And there has been, you know, 3 times that have been significant that there have been changes in the most recent, which is the most, I'd say the most elaborate of the 3. And I go back to underscore some things that Scott and Bernard had said, and things on stewardship and the customization and Catholic social teachings. When I started back in the early 80s, I remember one of the archdioceses said, we want to incorporate the Catholic social teachings. And they also, at the same time, they wanted to make sure that they made money. They said it's important that we do both. And as new in the business, I thought, well, I'm wondering when you take out a subset of companies, either for restriction or for other reasons, if that would limit the returns. And in fact, we found over the years that it has not, and it hasn't been significant, but it's been a bit of a tailwind. As we look at what has changed, and there have been a number of items that have been, a number of issues that have been added. For example, on euthanasia and assisted suicide. I mean, not being involved in companies that are involved in that. Firearms. There are some distinctions being made between firearms for police, military, hunting, and otherwise. In vitro fertilization. Again, some of these issues were not even weren't even around when this was contemplated 30, 40 years ago. Gambling, gender reassignment, that is also a newer subject. The recreational cannabis and tobacco. As you know, we have been customizing this with our clients for a number of years. And to that effect, all of the clients have embraced USCCB guidelines in their own way for their own customization. But yes, there have been, with the implementation, there have been some new changes. We've actually back tested these changes to see how they would affect portfolios. And not unlike historically, the restrictions have not only not detracted, but the additional restrictions have actually added a slight, even a little bit more tailwind. So we're taking this on an implementation basis with each client, but there's certainly, it took them 18 years to come up with this, and we're making a thoughtful approach on the implementation.
Zela, I might add just on that I noticed at sort of first blush as you go through it, there's a lot more detail, and there's more alignment with the language of Catholic social teaching. And so in that sense, the USCCB guideline, was more consistent with guidelines I've seen at the Vatican, for example, where they might have 7 or 8 sort of broad categories. USCCB has 5, but they include the same kinds of things. But I like that there's more alignment with the language of Catholic social teaching and how they sort of describe each of these issues.
Yes, Bernard, did you want to add anything? I saw you nodding. So
yeah, just nodding. I think the only thing I would add is to build on what Steve just said about the increasing possibilities to customize and to, in that sense, express the vision and the values that you have as an institution. And that's one of the things that over the years that I've now been working on this from an investor's point of view, it never ceases to amaze me how much more is possible every time you circle back to something a number of years later. You go back to your service providers or data providers and ask them, so we're thinking about this, what can you do for us? And they say, we're just developing something new in that direction. Tell me about it. And you work with them and help. You can actually help create and form some of what the data providers are providing. If you are challenging them and say, look, we're thinking about these issues, animal welfare. How are you thinking about that? How do I, what is possible there? For example, is one of the things that we were working on not that long ago. And you discover that there's all this work that's being done in the background that you can then profit from as an investor who wants to try and use this to craft a portfolio that is really very much an expression of your values, of a Catholic value set. And it's one of the things that I think is most interesting and exciting about the journey that is responsible investing, is that it's constantly evolving.
It's true. Well said. So let's say you're a diocese, you're a high school, or you're a university, and given all this information, all these changes, how, from a practical perspective, how do you implement these guidelines and these changes? And maybe Bernard, we can start with you. Can you give us a practitioner's approach as to what, how do you do this? How do you get started?
Yeah, and so from I have had some experience, of course, starting 7 years ago when we really started this journey from, I would say, a low level. The key thing really is to start by drafting a responsible investing policy, figuring out sort of what are our values as an institution, how do we think about aligning mission and investment portfolio, how do we think we want to approach our asset managers, what are our goals? And with that document in hand, I found that you can then start to think bit by bit, step by step about the following progression, the things that we've already mentioned here. Discussion around proxy voting, a discussion around an engagement policy or joining an investor network, an engagement network, talking about exclusions, what is possible in our portfolio, what tools do we have, and then at some point thinking about impact investing, what does that mean for us? But these are, it's all much too much if you try and do it all at the same time. If you really do it step by step, you're always, I think the old adage holds true, you overestimate what you can do in a year, but you definitely underestimate what you can do in 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, and I might just add, Zela, that a lot of Catholic organizations were doing a really nice job with the USCCB guidelines in the US, but then when ESG sort of became more in vogue and then impact investing is getting more attention, there was initially some concern about how you're going to mesh all of that and how you're going to describe that to your constituencies. But there is a lot of overlap, and I didn't have any trouble speaking to all of that in my role at Notre Dame because there was a lot of consistency. Now, I certainly had problems with some of the metrics being used in ESG, which don't really measure what they're supposed to. And a lot of that's been very commercialized by the investment banks. And so there's a lot of reason to be cautious on some aspects of that. But there's also parts of it that are very consistent. And certainly impact investing, which historically connotated a purely social investment, really now means a blend of social and financial. And there's a universe and an opportunity set there that's now massive. You think of the environment and technology enablement across these various sectors that really do impact communities and people's lives and quality of life. So a lot of synergies, but it does take some effort to kind of bring it all together and have the proper information and so forth. So it's a lot of work. That's why you need Steve.
And allow me to underscore to as my colleagues have said, there's a sequencing to this, of education to this, of bringing people along. And I agree, Scott and Bernard, it's a journey, and all the way down to where you get to the impact investing. I have been fortunate to sit on the Catholic Relief Services Investment Committee, and we have several committee members who have added a lot in that impact investment program. And even University of Notre Dame had a conference on that a few years ago in Rome. And but it's sequencing the process and making sure we walk before we run.
Absolutely. And given all this information too, speaking of impact, we started a Catholic private equity impact fund a year or two ago. And Scott, like you mentioned, there's so many technological investments and innovations in that product. It's not just, homeless shelters and things like that.
Right.
So folks are able to make money while investing with impact in mind and ESG in mind. So, I feel like most investment committees have this notion that by investing in, with Catholic social teaching in mind, they're going to be giving up on returns. And Steve, you alluded to that earlier in your comments. Can we just spend a few more minutes on that? I know that, Steve, you've done some lot of research on that topic. I was wondering if you could share some of your findings.
Yes, and I think it's really important, obviously, to have this data driven and the implementation. With the current additional, if we're looking at simply the part of the restrictive list, where historically it would have been about an 11 basis point tracking error over 5 years. It's now about 16 basis points, but it's to the positive. Again, it's been a tailwind, which is probably the biggest thing that surprises most people, that if you're taking things out, at the end of the day, it does go back and forth. It depends on certain sectors, but now with the additional restrictions and implementations, actually broadens out those sectors. We've had early on, we've had clients that took dollars out of in portfolios and had some invested in the consistent with the Catholic teachings, and others not, just to see how that worked within indexed and active managers. And again, they had the same, they had the similar result, that it was not a negative deterioration over time. It was actually a slight positive. We're not going to suggest that you add this and it will always be a slight positive, but we are saying that the idea that it is taken away is inaccurate.
Well said. And Scott, can you add to that? Because you've invested very successfully with well-abiding Catholic social teaching guidelines.
Yeah, so there's a lot of factors, but certainly the size and sophistication of the portfolio and your ability to access proper substitutes plays a huge role. We certainly were able to do that, investing more in private markets and buyout funds and venture capital, for example. And we could avoid other things and make up for any potential for lack of return or lost return by just being with higher quality managers and better funds. That was certainly part of it. But it's not something I really worried about. It is so inherent to what we are and what we do. I never went back and calculated any performance. I thought that would just be kind of a wasted. It wasn't going to change. We're not going to change what we're doing. And a lot of these industries are not very good industries. A lot of them are kind of crappy. So it wasn't that I feel like I was missing much in some of them. Others are more important in society, and some of the pharmaceutical companies we couldn't invest in was because of a small amount of products they were selling, and that was unfortunate. But that's just something you have to do as a Catholic investor to be consistent with Catholic social teaching. But we were able to find very appropriate substitutes that added much more value beyond what we were ultimately restricting.
Definitely, especially private markets, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I don't know. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, look, in venture capital, which is very technology focused, I can't think of one investment we did in the venture space that was objectionable. And of course, there was a lot of conversation up front with managers, to talk through what they would be doing and make sure that there was potential for that. We knew about that up front. Sometimes we would pass on a firm, whether it was a hedge fund or any asset class. We could always pass on some if we weren't sure they were going to be compliant, or maybe they just didn't want to take seriously our concerns here. Life is short. There's a lot of firms. There's a lot of good firms. And we were able to just say no, including a couple of very top buyout funds that earned very high returns and coveted having Notre Dame as a partner. But ultimately, we couldn't get comfortable with some of their healthcare investments. And it was a big part of their program, and they would not guarantee us any kind of restrictions or side letter. We would often try to get a side letter with our funds that if they were doing a deal that was objectionable, we could be carved out of that deal. And because of our size and sophistication, I guess, and long-term partnership principles, they were willing to do that for someone like us. It does happen. People have to ask, and not everybody will do it, but some do. And I think maybe for us, they thought it was important to their business long-term to have someone like us. But these are things you can all, try to do, to have a more compliant portfolio. As Bernard said from the beginning, it's a journey. You keep trying, do the best you can, and you're hoping that a very high percentage of your fund is consistent and compliant. You can feel good about that. And there might be some small amount that you're still working on, but at least you're trying. Because what I found over the years was a lot of Catholic organizations wanted to do this, but they actually really weren't doing anything. And so doing something is obviously better than nothing.
Definitely. Yes, I mean, as you know, we talked to a lot of Catholic institutions, and they've stayed away from private equity because they feel like it's too difficult to implement. But like you said, there are definitely ways of doing it, and we've been doing it successfully. Bernard, did you want to add to that? I'm sorry, Steve, maybe.
No, after Bernard, I was going to underscore something Scott had said there.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of great things that were just said. I would add a couple to them. My own experience has been that we have outperformed our benchmarks with a serious Catholic policy in place. I have found that an exclusion policy, or our exclusion policy, has just added value. We do track it, but do so with very much the same attitude as Scott has just mentioned. We're not going to change who we are. That's the value of that policy paper at the beginning, to define who you are, and then have afterwards the implementation. And yes, you should know where you stand in that regard, but it's definitely not obvious that it detracts value. What we have found actually is that it reduces volatility, because some of the sectors that you end up excluding actually are a source of volatility that isn't particularly helpful in your portfolio either. So slightly better returns, lower volatility has been our experience. And as we continue to move towards positive investing, which is actually where I think long-term we would like to end up, that you actually see that the managers that you consider that are most positive, and I think these are some of the ones that Scott would also refer to, ones that are innovative, building businesses, great technology investments, that those are ones that you can generate very nice returns with, while at the same time being really proud of the investments and understanding them in quite some detail in private market situations in particular.
Yeah.
I was just going to add that it is Bernard's and your foundation's own internationally, and Scott with Notre Dame and your esteemed record there. Many private equity and alternative managers, as we also see, want to work with the church. But at the end of the day, it's doing the homework up front, like you all have done. See if we get the side letters. It's interesting when you're in this world every day, and you know the managers that would be consistent and not. And getting into the alternative world, which is obviously there's the illiquidity and it's a little bit more challenged. I think in practice, I think in our discussions, there was only one time that had come up about where, after the fact that somebody did something and was able to get out of it, was able to work out of that situation. And again, I think it's important to do the work up front and have thoughtful organizations like ourselves that are in this to be able to avoid those pitfalls.
Definitely. We're going to ask one more question and then turn to audience questions that are starting to come in. Bernard, I remember you saying, and you mentioned this earlier, that as long as you're engaged, you are on the right track, and this is a journey. And could you elaborate a little bit more on that before we turn to audience questions?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. I found that in dialogue with other foundations, other investors, that at times the project is too big for them to wrap their minds around, and so they end up doing very little. Or there are concerns about returns or otherwise about capabilities, about costs, that in the end, I think, hold people back from taking that first step. And that's really where I've become very encouraging to just get started, in that there is, in that sense, already a benefit to being on the journey. I approach this a little bit from a philosophical perspective. I think that as Pope Francis says, there's a call to reimagine our reality, to reimagine capitalism in a certain extent, to make sure it is a more fulsome capitalism than it is today. And that comes from a discussion around values. And the more people that are having a values discussion with their asset managers, with that whole industry, I think the more those considerations will flow into the lives and the realities of a really important segment, a steering segment of the economy. And so for me, it's from a foundation perspective, it's important to bring other people along in the journey that is responsible investing. And so I think it is something that you can do in steps. And we should take along all of the natural partners that are out there in this, like all of the ESG focused investors, whereas Scott has already said, there's a huge degree of overlap, and there's, a huge number of studies that also show that ESG investing does not detract from performance, and that it's very much down to manager skill and selection and all of the factors that otherwise apply to succeeding in asset management. That are in fact the relevant factors. And it's not ESG investing, it's not Catholic values-based investing that will drive or detract from your return. Rather, it's that it is a lens that you add into your investments that aligns you with your purpose and who you are, that makes it an important journey to be on. And no one, I think, should be pointing a finger at somebody else saying you should be doing this or you should be doing it that way. As long as people are engaged with it, I think they're on the right step and adding to that bigger picture that I mentioned a moment ago.
Well said. Okay, we have a bunch of questions that have come in. Let's maybe start asking those. There's a question here from Daniel. It says, it seems to me that there are enormous opportunities to invest in good things, including renewable energy and energy efficiency projects for Catholic facilities that are consistent with what Pope Francis called for in Laudato Si. Our future is threatened by climate change, and this is a primary concern for young people. The church can lower greenhouse gas emissions, save money on energy costs, pour these savings into core mission activities, as well as be a great witness to young people that the church cares about. What advice would you give to investors for these types of projects? I feel like maybe, Bernard, this is a good one for you.
Look, I think it's having done a lot of renewable energy investing over time, I know it's not really for the faint of heart. It does demand a particular skill set, although it has all of the great attributes you just mentioned. I think it's something to find a really good manager for and do it via them. There are certain managers that are engaged heavily with Catholic institutions and dioceses about real world local opportunities. And so those are definitely worth investigating, but it is something that you really do need to find the right manager for. It's a tricky world sometimes, energy investing more broadly, and so you want to be with the right people.
Definitely. Steve?
I'm just going to say, and it dovetails on what Bernard had said previously as well as now, the first step of any journey is the biggest step, and everybody's going to be along this journey and to their own to their own situation. But being aware of being in this space and being aware of the managers is very, very important. And those who spend every day into this you can at least offer the options and help navigate this.
Okay, oh my gosh, we have so many questions. I'm trying to see which ones would make sense. There's a question here. Much of what's being discussed focuses on what not to invest in. It seems to me there are enormous opportunities to invest in. I think we actually, what am I saying? We answered that question, I believe. There's one, Scott, for you. In your investment review meetings, did you have a standard part of each meeting agenda that focused on progress, on impact investing or Catholic investing, besides investment performance reviews?
Yeah, so what we did an annual sort of SRI review with our investment committee of the board. We would talk about the policy, any changes to it, talk about some of the emerging factors involved. So for example, when ESG became more prominent in impact investing, it received more attention, kind of how are we managing that, or what are we doing, that kind of thing. So we had an annual review of our policies, of our implementation, all of that. It was really once a year, very thoroughly. Now, there were times when something new would come up during the year and we'd want to keep them apprised of how we were approaching it. But it was a very disciplined, cadence to make sure the board was fully up to date on what was happening out there. And if they brought information to our attention, we would address that as well. But yes, the answer is yes, but it was a sort of a formal annual review.
And Zela, let me butt in here if I could, and just answer that in the context of our private market strategy, which is we're doing through our partner Hamilton Lane a very thorough investment review of each investment. Then we do a separate independent impact review of that investment, and then after that, once it gets through those two hurdles, it comes to us for a Catholic SRI screening. So I think we've been able to institutionalize that in a pretty effective way.
Maybe just to add a slightly different perspective, inside of our foundation, we have an investment committee, but next to that, we actually have a responsible investing committee that really sets responsible investing policies separate from the investment committee, and that interacts with managers on a separate basis from the investment committee to in fact really highlight the importance of the responsibility side of the equation, along with the discussion the investment committee is having with managers. So there is some value to my mind in thinking about splitting the role and to really make sure that both conversations are had in the way that you want them to. But it's every organization needs to find its own way of finding the right balance and the right path forward, depending upon their team and capabilities.
That's great to have the resources to do that. That's fantastic, Bernard. Okay, we have a question here, which I'll ask again. We answered most of it, but maybe there's a different angle. You spoke a lot about additional restrictions in the new guidelines. Can you speak more about the broader stewardship responsibilities of engagement and positive screens, impact investing, etc.?
So yes, you have, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, very good. You have, you start off with the must avoids, then there are also the should avoids, and then there's the proxy voting, which is obviously something that is evolved and is working well. There is the engagement, to which there are numerous avenues to go down and to either, as Scott said, you could pick certain issues or go down that road, or you could embrace to the best of one's ability all of them. And there's the impact investing, and the impact investing obviously is one where we measure not just we look at the impact, but we also want to make sure, again, for the particularly when you're looking at emissions that we have return. As I go back to 40 years, I was instructed, make sure we're in line with Catholic social teachings, but also we must make money and be competitive. And I believe you can have both at the same time.
Thank you, Steve. Much appreciated. We have a question here. Will you be addressing the rate of return on these investments? Some nonprofit organizations need returns for survival of their work. And Scott, I don't know, do you want to take that on?
So the question is, sorry.
Will you be addressing the rate of return? This person is saying some of us nonprofits need returns to survive. And I know we said that folks are not going to be sacrificing on returns, but maybe you can offer a different perspective.
Well, we all need a return. That's why we have these funds to do good works and have good underlying purposes. So we certainly need a return. In fact, donors expect that they're going to have the highest level of stewardship and fiduciary responsibility in the monies they give. And there's no reason we shouldn't be a first class in how we do that. But that's not inconsistent with being compliant with Catholic social teaching, as we've been discussing on this call. And despite the noise and the complexity of markets, in some ways the implementation is easier today than it was. So there's more people out there to help you. There's more product. Catholic Investment Services. You have consultants like Steve. There's a lot more resources for investors to call on to assist them with this than there used to be. So you should be able to put a program together that does both very, very well.
Thank you, Scott. Next question. Go ahead, Bernard.
Just wanted to add that many people who are interested in making investments that have concessionary returns, they do so as a very small portion of their portfolio. And I think that where it sometimes gets confusing is the dialogue around these very interesting, very progressive, very risky social investments from a return perspective. People extrapolate from those. I'm not going to do my whole portfolio on those, and nobody should. That isn't what those kinds of impact investments are for. I think if you as a foundation choose, like we do, to have a few % of your endowment invested in that fashion, that's a wonderful thing, and it's an extension of your mission. And we do those as joint projects of the Philanthropy Committee and the Investment Committee. But that's sort of the way we've structured those, and clearly says what our expectations are, whereas the Investment Committee is absolutely there to generate the best possible returns, as Scott has already said. There's no reason you can't combine Catholic social teaching with investment excellence.
I totally agree. Very well said, Bernard. This next question, I think, Steve, it's for you. It's saying, is there a common software being used across the industry that enables investment advisors to let investors know the percentage of a fund or portfolio that meets the USCCB guidelines? If not, do you see this kind of software being available at some point in the future? I think the short answer is you hired Steve, but anyway, I'll let him answer.
But there are several softwares that are being used, and I think having access and working with the various different softwares and understanding the strengths, and I will say the challenges, but the strengths of the opportunities in these different ones to come together with a total program. I also want to get back to what was earlier said, that you talk about putting together programs in investment asset classes like CIS, which you've done, as Scott has said, in a very high level, very thoughtful way, and consistent with Catholic social teachings. We do work with all the different vendors in this area, but obviously in your particular asset class, you have a lot of experience, and you're embracing this. So there are numerous different softwares out there. To say there's just one, and just to take it on face value, there's work that needs to be done after the data is collected. And we suggest you work with individuals who are in this every day.
I think we have time for one more question. Maybe Bernard, this is directed to you first, and then the others can chime in. Some think it is better to be a shareholder and influence the actions of an organization rather than not owning a stock. This argument is being used in the fossil fuel space. Do you have any comments?
I think that's one of those great questions for which there is no right or wrong answer. I think every organization needs in its policy statement to sort of figure out, where are we on this? Where do we come down on it? And then execute against that point of view. I know people who do both sides of that very, very well and authentically. I think that you should be skeptical of fossil fuel investments from a risk return perspective, but that's a different matter.
Yeah, it being a dying industry, right? Tom, do you see any other questions? And I don't know if we're close to the hour mark.
I think we're about out of time, and we certainly want to respect our audience's schedules. But let me just close by thanking our panel. Zela, thank you for a great job moderating and multitasking with the questions. Steve, Bernard, Scott, a wonderful conversation today. So much more that we could be talking about, but I think this is a great start for our audience. And again, we're happy to follow up with anyone offline, Zela, our colleagues with questions, and we're going to have a quick survey at the end of the session. So please, if you have time, fill it out. And thank you all for joining us today. And we hope that you are all going to be healthy and safe. And I think that concludes our session. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. God bless you.